there's one drug that put Albania on the map in terms of organised crime, then it's marijuana. Albania as a country has a long history of marijuana cultivation, dating back to the turbulent period of the 1990s. And it has long been Europe's largest producer of marijuana. In fact, in 2022, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, or the UNODC, listed Albania as the world's 7th largest producer of cannabis. So as we mentioned in previous episodes, part of the rise of the Albanian Mafia was built upon the marijuana trade. And this involves selling the drug across borders, or even trading it with other organised crime groups in exchange for other drugs such as heroin or cocaine. Now, Albania itself, in terms of its geographic location and climate, make it ideal for the cultivation of the cannabis crop, but also had the right social conditions as well, particularly in the 1990s, where there was very weak law and order and the state didn't have much reach. Now, this was a time of mass planting of cannabis, especially in the south of Albania. A few reasons for this, including few other economic prospects. As we mentioned, very little law and order, especially in that part of the country, which was home to a significant presence of armed gangs, especially in 1997, as well as the fact that cultivation of drugs wasn't even regulated in the country until the mid-1990s. Now, one village in particular grew a reputation as the epicenter of marijuana production in Albania, and that's the village of Lazarat in the south of the country in the Gjirokastra region.
Since the 1990s, Albania has been one of the biggest cannabis producers in Europe, with production growing rapidly during the 2000s. Lazarat, which is a village near the Greek borders, became the center for cannabis cultivation and produced almost half of the total amount of marijuana produced in Albania. It is believed that this situation was known to authorities for years. However, it was in 2014 when the Albanian police organized its biggest operation and raided the village, which led to intense shootouts between farmers and gang members and the police. During that operation, police seized at least 23 tons of marijuana and a very large amount of firearms and ammunition. During this period, when the Albanian government declared war on marijuana and EU accession negotiations were ongoing, the Albanian police did a lot of raids, and the production of marijuana decreased, although it still continued, but mainly moved to more remote areas.
So a lack of economic alternatives simply led people to move to another part of the country in more isolated areas and start marijuana plantations there. So in 2016, Albanian police recorded record seizures of cannabis plants and marijuana. So given the gravity of the situation and Albania's ongoing application to join the European Union, which again was contingent on cracking down on organised crime and the trafficking of drugs into Europe and European Union countries, in 2017 the Albanian government came up with a 3-year action plan to eradicate the production of cannabis in the country. Now, by and large, this was fairly successful because the numbers of cannabis seized in 2021 is substantially lower than that in 2017, which suggests that marijuana production in the country itself is declining. However, while outdoor cultivation has decreased, Albania still remains one of Europe's largest producers of cannabis. And as we mentioned at the start of this video, in 2022, it was named as the 7th largest producer of cannabis in the world, so it's still producing a significant amount of the drug.
The country is now considered the main source and distributor of marijuana in Europe, with the majority of the plantations being concentrated in the Skondra region. Poverty continues to lead many locals to work in cannabis plantations, while corruption remains widespread in the country. Most of the product is trafficked north through Montenegro, east through North Macedonia, south through Greece, and west through Greece or across the Adriatic Sea to the port of Bari in Italy. In Greece, marijuana cultivated in Albania travels through the roads connecting the Greek-Albanian borders with the ports of Igoumenitsa and Patra. And from there, it travels west to Italy, or it is sent towards Athens to be distributed within the country, or it travels to Turkey. Many shipments of marijuana that are trafficked to Turkey are exchanged for shipments of heroin.
Get in-depth insight on the activities of Albanian organised crime. Transnational organised crime is one of the biggest threats to security in Europe today, and the Albanian Mafia is one of the most significant organised crime groups on the continent. Using open source reporting and data from the Intelligence Fusion Threat Intelligence platform, we'll be releasing a comprehensive report on the state of Albanian organised crime groups and their impact on global security. Sign up now to receive the report as soon as it's released. Click the link in the description below. So something else to keep an eye on is the fact that in June 2022, the Albanian government expressed an interest in legalising the production of medical cannabis and industrial hemp. Now, this would be for export only. Given the alleged links between Albanian politics and organised crime, this is certainly something that could be potentially open to exploitation. So as we've mentioned, Albania is a major source country for cannabis destined for European Union countries. Now, this is something that the US Department of State has actually highlighted in its report on the country. So the trafficking of cannabis from Albania is a key form of income for these groups, especially early on. It was a key way of building relationships with other groups. And in fact, this is still going on in the present day. For example, as well as swapping cannabis for heroin with Turkish groups, it's also believed that Albania is a transit country for hashish from the Middle East. However, recent developments suggest that Albania itself as a source country for marijuana, while still significant, is becoming less vital for Albanian organised crime groups as they are transitioning to other methods of supplying the drug. So according to a Global Insight for Transnational Organised Crime report in 2020, the wholesale price of cannabis from Albania has increased quite significantly. So in 2015, the wholesale price was around about 700 euros per kilogram. In 2020, it's more like 1,300 euros per kilogram, which suggests that the supply has actually diminished and has been affected by the crackdown by Albanian authorities. However, it's not just police in Albania that have become more vigilant towards Albanian marijuana trafficking. It's also police in other European countries. So traditionally, the route from Albania into Italy was over the Adriatic Sea or the Ionian Sea by a speedboat. Police in Italy are much more aware of this route now, and it's more highly patrolled, and the risk of interdiction has increased significantly. So increasingly what we're seeing are reports of marijuana plantations springing up within Europe itself and being run by Albanian gangs. Now notably, this includes neighbouring countries such as Greece or Italy, but it also includes countries such as Spain, Belgium and the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom too. Now reportedly, a kilo of cannabis grown indoors in Western Europe can sell for around about 3,000 euros, which is significantly higher than the cannabis produced outdoors in Albania, and comes without the additional risk and costs that comes with smuggling it over a larger distance. Increasingly, clandestine cannabis operations are being run on an industrial scale by these groups in Western Europe.
Marijuana plantations are, they range in size from say, say at least 10 plants, to even large-scale operations where there's hundreds or even thousands of plants done on in a similar fashion to their. It's like, imagine, I suppose, any kind of standard agricultural crop, and in that case, swap that particular whatever crop for marijuana instead. What's been noted, probably the one thing that's been quite noticed about them is that they can be done just about anywhere, which is quite a remarkable thing for Europe, because there's not much space around. I mean, we've logged incidents of marijuana plantations being in rooms of an apartment or an entire apartment, even to unused warehouses, or or even in some cases farmland. Coming across large open fields, being used for growing the crop. It's probably, if there's been one sort of recent change with marijuana plantations, it's not been as it's been a bit hard to track. But what I have noticed is in the wake of the lockdowns across Europe, have come across instances of closed down businesses, with those places now places being empty. That's provided ideal real estate, although it's not been as prevalent as I would have anticipated. Either that, or it's a case of that sort of trend isn't showing up as much in open source reporting. So there's probably the one change I've noticed is the potential for an increased amount of real estate for organised crime groups to use marijuana plantations. I mean, come across ones of, as I mentioned before, old warehouses, or there was even one would have been, I think, during the first sort of lockdowns in the UK, there was a marijuana plantation found in a closed down cafe on the same street as the Bank of England. So they can be just about anywhere.
Well, the profits from these enterprises can be massive. Plants can number in the thousands in a single operation, and one raid by police can lead to the seizure of crops that are worth millions. Now, additionally, growing cannabis indoors is actually more reliable than growing it outdoors, as it's not vulnerable to things such as weather conditions like any other outdoor crop. And a controlled environment also allows the regulation of the THC within the plant itself, while controlled light and watering conditions can accelerate the production process, meaning that the plants could be harvested more frequently. And again, because these marijuana plantations are closer to the end market, it comes with less logistical risk and costs too.
With marijuana plantations, you can essentially shorten the logistics, which means it's much easier to get your product to your consumers. It reduces the travel time between your point of production to your point of sale. And with the various ways that you can run a marijuana plantation in just about anywhere across Europe, it makes the supply chains so much more reliable, because of the shorter distances to transport to produce the marijuana, process it and process it for sale and consumption. The marijuana plantations in an apartment, for example, or even a disused warehouse, you can just produce the marijuana much quicker and get it to consumers in a much quicker fashion as well.
However, these marijuana plantations aren't just for supplying the domestic market within the country that they're located. So, as well as cannabis being trafficked from Albania and then west across the rest of Europe, it's also being trafficked across borders from countries such as Spain. Now, this is something that features regularly in the reporting on our platform. A recent example is a Europol operation which led to the arrest of over 100 criminals across Spain, majority of them Albanian speaking. Arrests took place in 42 different locations across the country. And as part of this criminal operation, the plantation and the cultivation of marijuana would take place in grow houses in Spain before being distributed across the rest of Western Europe. In the UK, meanwhile, Albanian-speaking groups are said to have brought a so-called ruthless professionalism to the market. So here we also see the ways in which Albanian groups' criminal enterprises begin to overlap. So we mentioned in the previous episode on human trafficking that the trafficking of migrants into the UK is also providing a steady supply of labour to the illegal marijuana trade in the country. So often these indoor plantations are staffed by a live-in illegal migrant who's been trafficked across borders and is then tasked with looking after the plants within the crop house itself. Now, some of the time these migrants are employed from Albania with the knowledge that that's what they will be going across to do. In many cases, these migrants have paid Albanian trafficking groups significant sums to smuggle them across borders, for instance, through lorries, or Albanian crime gangs themselves will have paid their fare with the gangs who are running small boat crossings, for example, and they then impose a debt bondage on the migrant where they are made to work off their debt within these grow houses. Now, Albanian migrants arrested at these marijuana plantations frequently state that their employers are threatening the safety of their families back home in Albania in order to coerce them into cooperating with them. As we mentioned in the previous episode, Albanian nationals are the highest foreign nationality referred to the modern slavery mechanism in the UK. Now, in other cases, Albanian illegal migrants are recruited within the UK. So, for example, a migrant who's entered the country illegally and therefore can't find work through legal means might be working in construction or in enterprises such as car washes for around about £100 a day. Now, in comparison, they can earn around £1,000 a week working within one of these marijuana plantations. Now, upon arrival to the UK, many migrants are placed within hotels temporarily, and there are reports that Albanian gangs are recruiting directly within these hotels, and that migrants are disappearing within days of arrival. Again, as we mentioned in the previous episode on human trafficking, Albanian gangs are also attempting to recruit migrants in northern France. So again, offering them passage into the UK on the proviso that they then work for them on arrival, or offering them significant wages that they might not otherwise be able to earn. The National Crime Agency, meanwhile, as we mentioned again in the previous episode, have said that a lot of these migrants appear to have been coached to state that they are victims of modern slavery, and that they produce a standard letter asking to be referred to the modern slavery referral mechanism. Now, regardless of the how and why these gardeners entered the UK, their presence and the ruthless professionalism brought to the market by Albanian gangs has led to Albanians now becoming the leading producers of cannabis within the UK, so displacing the Vietnamese who previously led the market. Now, while this may be expected to lead to conflict between the two groups as they potentially battle over control of the market, in fact, there are reports that suggests cooperation between the two groups. So, for example, in Coventry, a raid on a former nightclub found that it had been turned into a 3-story marijuana plantation worth over £1 million in terms of the crops that were seized. Now, this was run by Albanian criminals and Vietnamese criminals. However, their presence within the cannabis market has still led to violence, despite Albanian groups often being characterised by their willingness and their preference for cooperation with criminal gangs. Incidents involving Albanian criminals feature violence a lot more readily when it is around the cannabis trade, and this is particularly linked to a form of criminality called taxing, and this is where a rival criminal gang will target a marijuana plantation run by another gang and essentially steal their crop to sell themselves. So, for example, in December 2021, a migrant by the name of Jovan Pepaj, who's a 25-year-old Albanian illegal migrant living in a grow house, was murdered when a rival gang targeted the property he was living at in Tunbridge Wells in Kent in order to steal the marijuana that was being grown there. In other cases, though, we see reports of Albanian gangs defending their territory quite violently. So in another case, an Albanian gang murdered a would-be thief after they were alerted to an attempted burglary by one of the people living there. Tomasz Varga from Dagenham is said to have travelled up from London with 3 others in order to rob a grow house in Cardiff. Now, the Albanian gang who were running the cannabis farm intercepted the burglars while they were at the address and carried out what was being described as a brutal assault on Mr. Varga and another associate who was in the address at the time. They then bundled him into the back of the car and interrogated him before dumping his body on the side of the road and leaving him for dead. Now, in November 2022, 8 members of an Albanian Manchester-based organised crime gang received a combined total of 85 years in prison after they confronted a rival gang in Burnley who were attempting to tax one of their cannabis farms in the town. And this confrontation involved 2 people from the gang attempting to rob them being shot by the Albanian gang. Our reports claim that Albanian gangs use kidnapping, forced imprisonment, torture and beatings as a form of retribution on those who are believed to have robbed their grow houses. And in fact, some groups actually post footage on social media platforms such as TikTok to intimidate other groups. There are also unconfirmed reports that people involved in missing persons cases have disappeared as a result of being abducted and killed by Albanian gangs in retribution for robbing their cannabis plantation. So Albanian groups have used their know-how and their expertise within the marijuana trade built up over several years in Albania itself to now corner the market in the cultivation of marijuana and the trafficking of marijuana within Western European countries as well. But it's another drug that is really responsible for their rapid rise and their success, and that's cocaine. So in the next episode, we'll be discussing how Albanian organised crime groups became the leading players in the cocaine market in Europe.